Now we're going to talk about wage and hour law and also briefly about labor unions. So first, with regard to wage and hour law, we have child labor laws in this country. We want to encourage minors to stay in school and finish their education, so we put limits on the number of hours that they can work in a week. We have a minimum wage. You probably know what the minimum wage is in California. A lot of you are probably working for that minimum wage. We have an ongoing political controversy about whether or not the minimum wage should be raised. Every time they talk about raising the minimum wage, the people say we're not being paid enough just to live. And in California, that's probably true with the outrageously high real estate prices and rentals rates that we have. But on the other hand, the counter argument is if you force us small business employers to pay a higher wage to our employees, we're going to be able to hire fewer of them. There's going to be even fewer jobs available then than there are now. And it doesn't do that much good to raise the minimum wage because the price of a loaf of bread and a gallon of gas goes up, the rent goes up, and it all balances out anyway. So an ongoing political disagreement about whether or not the minimum wage should be raised. And I guess your opinion on that varies with whether you are a minimum wage employee or you're a small business owner employer. Overtime pay, we have laws that say if they work you longer than a 40-hour work week or the 8-hour or 10-hour day, depending on what work arrangement you have, they have to pay you time and a half for overtime. The thing you need to know about overtime for test purposes in this course is there are certain types of employees that are exempted from the requirement that you pay them time and a half for overtime. The first category of employees that are exempted are administrative people and executive people. We pay them a high salary and we expect to be able to work them long hours in return for that high salary. So administrative people and executives, professional people like doctors and lawyers, we pay them a big salary and we work them long hours. Outside salespeople, that kind of makes sense because if your outside salesperson is traveling from place to place making sales calls and you have to pay him by the hour for all of his travel time, you'd have to pay him so much money in overtime you wouldn't be able to afford to have any outside salespeople. So you give them commissions and a small salary and that's enough. So that one makes sense to me. The one that has never made sense to me is computer people. They're exempted from time and a half for overtime, and I guess that's how Bill Gates can get away with locking his people up in a room and giving them nothing but diet soda and Twinkies and saying don't come out until the software works. There was a lawsuit a while back by some computer people trying to take exception to the exception that says they don't have to be paid time and a half. I haven't followed that. I don't know whether that has changed, but for test purposes in here, you just need to know executives, administrative people, professional people, and outside salespeople are exempted from time and a half for overtime. Okay, that's all we're going to say about wage and hour law. We're going to move on now to labor unions. And it's kind of a good segue because there are many benefits as an employee that you have these days. See, I was raised in a conservative Republican household. My father was a colonel in the Air Force, and he said labor unions are all a bunch of mafia guys, you know, and liberal Democrats, and stay away from the unions. And, you know, it may be true that there's some corruption and maybe some criminal elements involved in some labor union organizations, but the fact of the matter is that you have a lot of benefits like a 40-hour work week and Sundays off, and some people get health benefits through their employers. You get those things because people fought and sometimes even died for those things in labor unions in the early years of the industrialized age. So the unions did a lot of good. You know, they've lost a lot of their power in the last few years because when the price of American labor got driven up too high, the large companies just moved their labor outside the country, and they moved their manufacturing plants to China and other places where labor was cheaper. There is, however, some speculation that as labor gets more and more expensive in those other countries, some of that labor, some of that business and the labor will be moved back to this country. So here's hoping. In the meantime, however, some basic things to know about labor unions. In the early years, there was a lot of violence and destruction that was involved in the establishment of labor unions and strikes. And because of that, the federal government created the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA, and the National Labor Relations Board, which is that it? Yeah, the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, the federal agency to regulate union activities and the attempts to unionize businesses. And those laws have helped to reduce a lot of the corrupt stuff that went on, employers hiring private detectives to go out and beat people up that were trying to establish unions, and union members vandalizing employers' businesses and equipment, and violence during labor strikes. In the early years of this country, the United States Army was called out when the miners went on strike, and the miners were actually shot by American military people. The violence was that bad. It was like a war. So hopefully we don't have much of that anymore. And when we do this class live, I usually pick out one person and I say, you're a young person. You started working for my company at 18. You didn't need much money then. You were happy. You were splitting your rent with two other guys who were sharing an apartment. And if you had enough money that you could pay your bills and have some beer money on Friday night, you were happy. But you've been working at my company for 5 years and your life has changed. Now you're married and you got a baby or two on the way. You need an apartment of your own. You need more money, but you're still doing about the same job for me that you've been doing since the beginning. And you come as an individual to negotiate with me, the business owner, for a pay raise. And your job is one that is pretty much interchangeable. It's not a lot of training or skill involved, so I could let you go and replace you pretty easily. So if you come as an individual to bargain for a pay raise, do you have any negotiating leverage at all? Little or none. But if you form a union and you come to me and you say, I'm the shop foreman for the union, and you're going to give us all a 5 or 10% pay raise this year, or we're all going to go on strike, you won't have any workers and your business will be shut down and will be losing money for as long as we're on strike. Do you have some negotiating leverage then? Yeah. So that's the basic premise of how a union works. If you want to form a union at your place of business, you pass out these little cards to the employees to see if there's enough interest in the employees to form a union. If at least 30% of them say yes, we'd like to have a union, then you have an election at the place of business to see whether or not the union comes in. And if they come in, then you negotiate with the employer as a group, as a union, for whatever it is that you want from him, a pay raise or health care benefits or whatever it is that you want. If you get what you want, great. You have a contract with the employer, between the union and the employer, for a year, a couple years. If you don't get what you want, then you may have to go out on strike. And if you go out on strike, you stop working. When you stop working, the employer has the legal right to hire replacements for you if he can get them. Some people are not replaceable, too highly training or skill level. But ordinary workers that don't need much skill level or training, he can hire replacements. The unions hate those people. They call them scabs. And when they're out picketing, they have a picket line in front of the company, and the scab workers try to come across the picket lines to come to work. That's when violence and trouble occurs. The picketers try to stop the scabs. And the violence is all illegal, of course, but it happens sometimes. Now, here's an interesting thing. The labor relations law says that when the strike is over, if it's not negotiated in the new contract, the employer does not have to hire back the strikers. You've been out of work for days or weeks or months with no pay because you've been on strike. And when the strike is finally over, the employer says, well, I don't like you guys anymore. You went out on strike and I hired some good workers as scabs while you were gone. I'm just going to keep the scabs. You guys are out of luck. And he can do that as long as the strike was only about higher pay and money. If the strike was only about money and higher pay, the labor relations law says he does not have to hire back the old employees. But if the strike is about unfair labor conditions, safety at work, or some other unfair situation going on at work, then when the strike is over, the employer is required by law to hire back all the striking workers. And this is why every time you see a strike on TV and you see the picketers out front of the place of business picketing, there's always at least one guy carrying a sign that says unfair to labor or unfair labor practices. If there isn't really an unfair labor issue going on, the union has to make one up because that's the only way they can be assured that when the strike is over, everybody's got to get hired back. So let's see. Oh, one other thing about unions, and this does show up on your test. This is kind of important. You need to know the difference between a union shop, which is legal, and a closed shop, which is illegal. Now, if you had struggled and suffered and been through 2 years of agonizing strike and suffering and elections and all the things you had to do to get a union, and then because you got the union, you negotiated a better contract with the employer and you got a higher pay raise, maybe you got some health benefits, and you're happy with that, and then a new guy comes in to work at the company, and he wasn't there for any of that struggling and suffering, but he gets the same higher pay and the same health benefits, and you say, hey, how about joining our union? All you got to do is pay some dues once a year, but we need you in the group to support us in case we ever have to go on strike again. And the guy says, well, I appreciate that you got me a higher pay and stuff, but I don't like unions, and I don't want the union taking some of my paycheck for dues, so I'm not joining your union. You might have some pretty sore feelings about that non-union guy. He weakens your position, and next time you negotiate with the employer. So a lot of unions negotiate as part of their union contract a deal with the employer that says everybody who works here has to be a member of the union. And you can do that, but if you do it one way, it's legal, and if you do it the other way, it's illegal. The legal way is you do it what's called a union shop, and it says, well, everybody's got to join the union if they want to work here, but they don't have to be in the union when they come to work here. They can come to work here first, and if they want to stay, then after a first time period, a month or two, they've got to join the union. The other way to do it is you have to be a member of the union before you can even come to work here. That is called a closed shop, and that is illegal. Well, the end result is the same, whether it's a closed shop or a union shop. Either way, everybody that works here has got to be a member of the union. Why does it make any difference? Well, it makes a big difference to the employer, because in a closed shop where all the employees have to be a member of the union before they can even come to work at the company, the owner of the business no longer gets to hire and choose his own employees. If you want a job at my company now, and it's a closed shop, you don't come and ask me for a job, you go ask the union for a job, because the union picks and chooses. No one can come to work at my company until after they're in the union. So the union decides who gets in the company and who doesn't. And I don't like that, because I'm the owner of the business and I don't get to choose my own employees. In a union shop, however, which is legal, that's the closed shop, which is illegal. In a union shop, which is legal, you don't have to be in the union until after you've started work. I like that as the business owner, because I still get to choose who works at my company and who doesn't. And I'm not getting the union shop foreman's alcoholic cousin or something. I'm getting workers that I chose.